If there's one thing guaranteed to curl Nero Wolfe's lip faster than a misquoted Latin phrase, it's my shoes, specifically the ones I'd just walked in wearing. They were brown leather Oxfords, perfectly respectable footwear by my standards, but apparently offensive to the delicate fibres of the Persian runner in the front hall, especially since I'd collected a thin veneer of spring mud on them courtesy of West 42nd. "You," Wolfe said, without looking up from his copy of Cuisine et Vin de France, "have an enviable gift for irrelevance, Archie, but I urge you not to trample it across my rug." I paused, lifted one heel with deliberate ceremony, and offered the muddy sole for inspection. "A fair cop," I said. But I was acquiring information. From a ditch? From a delicatessen, if you must know. Fritz needed goose fat. I slipped out of the shoes and made my way into the front room in socks, still damp and only slightly less offensive to Wolfe's aesthetic. Fritz, humming in the kitchen, had already prepared the squab for dinner, roasted with an apricot glaze he'd hinted was inspired by a dish he once served to a minor German royal. I was just settling into my chair with the comforting smell of caramelized poultry drifting in when the doorbell rang. Wolfe grunted. "Phui, who is it?" "I'll find out," I said, getting up with a sigh. "But if it's the tax assessor, I'm pretending to be the butler." The woman who stepped into the front room was all angles and restraint. She wore a navy blue coat, tailored, expensive, and unadorned by anything as frivolous as buttons that didn't serve a purpose. Her eyes were grey, not steel grey, but the kind that suggested reflection, not threat. "I'm Leonora Drayton," she said, extending a gloved hand. "I manage a private dining club called the Thistle Room." "I apologize for the intrusion, Mr. Wolfe, but this concerns something rather peculiar." Wolfe did not rise. He nodded once, without warmth. "You may sit. Archie, record her particulars." "Yes, sir," I murmured, reaching for my notebook. "Though I'll need spelling on the restaurant if it turns out to be relevant." "It's a members-only establishment," she continued, ignoring the jab. "Discreet, high-end. Our patrons include politicians, industrialists, and a few minor celebrities with major appetites. One of our long-time waiters, Gerald Fenwick, has recently become problematic." "Discreet establishments rarely come here to advertise problems," Wolfe said. "Why not the police?" "Because there's been no crime," she said. "Only a man who, until yesterday, never blinked." Wolfe's eyebrow twitched. "Mr. Fenwick was known for his unusual presence. He could stand for hours without blinking. Patrons found it charming at first. Lately, however, there's been gossip, accusations that he was listening, watching, memorizing. Some called it unsettling. And now he's gone," she said simply. "Didn't report for the lunch shift, no call, no forwarding address." "People disappear every day," Wolfe replied. "It is their ancient privilege." "Yes," she agreed. "But not Fenwick. He was paid well, and afraid of something." I'd known Nero Wolfe long enough to spot it, the fractional shift in the line of his mouth when someone used a word he disliked. In this case, it was afraid. He didn't comment, but I saw the twitch. Ms. Drayton continued. "2 nights ago, Gerald asked to speak privately. He seemed nervous. He said nothing directly, but he implied someone at the Thistle Room had secrets worth keeping, that his memory, his perfect recall, had made him dangerous." "Did he elaborate?" Wolfe asked. "Number only that he felt he had seen something he was not meant to see, something that frightened him." "Was he known for dramatics?" "Hardly. Gerald was mechanical, polite, precise. If he said he was afraid, I believe he meant it." "And the clientele?" I asked. "Any recent fireworks on the floor?" She hesitated. "There was an incident. Congressman Silas Varden was overheard raising his voice at a woman. One of our younger members, I believe. Nothing public, but Gerald was serving their table. I doubt it escaped him." Wolfe closed his eyes, possibly from boredom, possibly to think. "There's more," she added, reaching into her handbag. "This was found beneath Gerald's serving tray. I wasn't sure what to make of it, but..." I think it was meant for someone. She extended a sealed envelope. No address, no label, just the faintest crease at the corner, as if someone had clutched it too tightly for too long. The envelope yielded a single item, a Polaroid photograph. It was a man's face, mid-scream. The background was too dark to distinguish, the image grainy, but the expression was unmistakable, fear, raw and immediate, captured in the flash of chemical memory. No name, no note. Just the scream, frozen in cellulose. Wolfe's hand paused as he examined it. He did not frown. Wolfe never frowned, but the stillness in his features deepened. "I dislike melodrama," he said. "Which this certainly qualifies as," I offered. "Do you recognize the man?" Ms. Drayton asked. Wolfe passed it to me. I studied it, shook my head. Number, but Gerald had it tucked under his tray. That suggests intent or panic. Wolfe tapped a finger on the armrest. "Miss Drayton, I will not promise pursuit. I require facts, not insinuations." "I understand," she said, rising. "But I hope, should you find reason, you'll remember Gerald." He served in silence. That should not be how he disappears. After she left, I turned the photo over. No writing, no date, just that face, that scream. Wolfe muttered, "Fritz, bring the sherry." That, I knew, meant thinking had begun. There are few things in life I enjoy more than walking into a high society dining room dressed like I own it, even when I don't. The Thistle Room was the kind of place where the salt came in cut glass, and the hostesses didn't so much smile as perform selective warmth. The decor was discreet, expensive, and deeply offended by anything resembling spontaneity. So naturally I fit right in. I'd made my entrance under the guise of a lunch reservation, though I had no intention of eating. Fritz would have taken it personally. Besides, Wolfe hadn't authorized an expense report that included duck confit and imported truffles. My purpose was simpler: take a look around, sniff the corners, and ask the kind of questions that make service staff twitch. The maitre d', slim, silver-haired, and slicker than a silk ascot, greeted me with enough chill to remind me I was only pretending to be important. I gave him the name Mr. Crandall and watched him disappear behind the podium like a magician. While he consulted his imaginary list, I wandered casually toward the rear service corridor, where uniforms moved like clockwork, and no one smiled unless tipped. There was a rhythm here, and Gerald Fenwick had been part of it, until he vanished. The absence of a cog is still a break in the machine, no matter how discreet the gears. A young busboy passed, eyes down, but he glanced up just once. I smiled and said, "You ever work with Gerald Fenwick?" He blinked. Once. It was a start. The Thistle Room's kitchen was a cathedral of stainless steel and strict hierarchy. You didn't just stroll through, unless, of course, you were me. I caught the eye of a young sous chef carefully arranging chive blossoms on a scallop dish. He had the look of a man with opinions and no outlet for them. My favorite kind. "Nice knife work?" I said, leaning on the counter. "Ever hear of a guy named Gerald Fenwick?" He flinched, which was promising. "You a cop?" he asked. "No, worse. I'm a private investigator. I write down what people say and pass it on to a man who makes them regret it." He snorted. "That sounds about right." "Care to tell me why the man who never blinked suddenly disappeared?" The sous chef wiped his hands. Gerald was off. Not in a bad way, he was just quiet, always listening. I mean, he could stand next to a table for 20 minutes and never move, like furniture, but smarter. Did he talk to anyone? Not much. But he watched everything. You'd look over and he'd be staring at someone's cufflinks like they were broadcasting secrets. Anyone take offense? A few. There was that scene with Congressman Varden. He yelled at that girl, Lillian or something, and Gerald just stood there, stone-faced, didn't flinch, didn't blink, like he was memorizing it. Did Gerald ever mention being scared? The chef hesitated, then nodded. A couple nights before he vanished, he asked for a few days off, said he needed to disappear for a bit. I joked about a beach in Bermuda. He didn't laugh. Did he take the days? Number he vanished the morning before the shift. Anything else? I asked. The chef looked around and leaned closer. He kept a notebook, small, leather-bound. I saw him scribbling once after a shift. I think he was writing things down. Where is it now? If I knew that, I'd be charging you double. The locker room in the back hallway was a low-ceilinged row of iron cabinets with brass handles and the faint aroma of starch and locker room politics. I'd picked up a master key from the head porter by telling him I was with insurance, a white lie I figured Gerald would appreciate wherever he was. Fenwick's locker was immaculate, a spare bow tie, a folded service apron with sharp creases, one pair of cufflinks shaped like silver knots. And tucked in the corner, behind the rolled-up collar of his white dinner jacket, was a small, clear glass vial sealed with a cork. I uncorked it and gave it a cautious sniff. Lilac. Not your drugstore kind, sharper, almost medicinal. It clung to the back of my throat like a dry warning. I resealed the vial and slipped it into my pocket. Wolfe would know what to make of it. He always did. Back at the front of the room, I casually dropped Gerald's name into conversation with a hostess on duty. Young, nervous hands, eyes that darted too often. The type who knew more than she wanted to. He was nice, she said quickly. Never bothered anyone? And yet he's gone, I said. Just like that. She lowered her voice. He knew things, the guests, said things around him, personal things. Maybe they forgot he was even there. He was just always there. Like when Congressman Varden yelled at that girl? Her lips went white. You shouldn't bring up Varden. Why not? Because no one here does. Not unless they want to stop working. Lou Pinder had the posture of a man who'd been behind the bar too long and liked it too much. He was cleaning a rocks glass with the kind of meticulousness usually reserved for surgeons or criminals with something to hide. "You're not here to drink," he said, before I'd even opened my mouth. "Nope, but I'm thinking about switching careers. You hiring?" He didn't smile. "We don't take wise guys, we serve them." "Nice. I'm looking into Gerald Fenwick." "Never heard of him." I raised an eyebrow. "That's impressive." "Most of the staff needs at least 5 seconds to lie." He set the glass down a little too hard. "Look, Gerald kept to himself. Too much, if you ask me. Stared at people, creeped them out." "Ever see him with a notebook?" Lou hesitated. "He took notes on wine pairings. Big deal." "Did you see him after the Varden argument?" "Number. And neither did you." "Touchy subject?" Lou leaned in. "Look, people say things here. People who pay good money to be left alone. Gerald didn't get that. Maybe he was just watching. Yeah, maybe. Or maybe he was building something. I don't know. He should have kept his eyes to himself." His tone was flat, but his hands had started to move faster, wiping, stacking, polishing. A man trying to erase something with motion. I said, "You don't miss him." "I don't miss people who think they're better than the job." He was a waiter. He thought he was a spy. And what do you think he saw? Lou looked me straight in the eye. Enough to make him disappear. Claudette Morel had the kind of delicate composure you see on pastry boxes, refined, well-framed, and just waiting to collapse under the right temperature. I found her behind the coat stand, discreetly straightening menus no one had touched. I gave her my most harmless smile. "Miss Morel, I have a confession. I came here for the food, but I'm staying for the secrets." She blinked rapidly, a deer with good posture. "I'm afraid I'm very busy." "Only for 30 seconds, I said. "That's about how long it'll take you to either tell me something useful or pretend Gerald Fenwick never existed." Her lip trembled. He didn't deserve what happened." "What happened?" She didn't answer. Her gaze drifted toward the dining room. "He was kind," she said. "He used to bring me pastries after shift, always the ones nobody ordered, raspberry tartlets mostly." "Sounds generous." "He listened, not just to guests, but to us. He noticed things. When my schedule changed, he asked if I was all right." When I broke a glass, he cleaned it up before the head waiter could scold me. He was quiet, but never absent. And he saw things. Her hands fidgeted. Yes, conversations, arguments, notes passed. He memorized them. It made people uncomfortable. Uncomfortable enough to silence him? I don't know. But you're afraid? She nodded. Was Gerald afraid? Another pause. Then, he said once, there are places where the plates are expensive, and the truths even more so. That was 2 nights before he vanished. Did he say who he meant? Number. But that night a man handed him something folded inside a wine list. Gerald didn't open it. He tucked it away. Her eyes brimmed. I think that was the last thing he received. Back at the brownstone, I filed my verbal report to Wolfe, who was in no mood to be interrupted, let alone impressed. He sat in the red chair by the window, arms crossed, eyes half-lidded, the very image of a man tolerating the incompetence of the world for another day. When I mentioned the lilac-scented vial, he stirred. "Bring it here." I placed it in his hand. He held it under his nose for a brief moment, then scowled. Atropa belladonna, diluted, irresponsible. Irresponsible for who? The poisoner or the waiter? He gave me a glance that suggested I should refrain from trying to be clever and instead succeed at being useful. "Congressman Varden," he said, "you mentioned his name 3 times. Only because 3 different people tried not to." "Precisely. You will call Saul." That wasn't a suggestion. That was Wolfe at his most decisive. I picked up the phone, dialed Saul Panzer's number, and waited. When he answered, I said, "You're being requested, no, commanded, to do what you do best, tail a man who doesn't like being watched." Name? Varden, Silas, Congressman. No fedora and false nose required. Just shadow him discreetly. Wolfe wants everything: who he meets, where he eats, and how much he tips. Understood. Saul hung up without pleasantries. Efficiency? Thy name is Panzer. I turned back to Wolfe, who had already begun drafting notes with his Mont Blanc pen. "Do you think Varden's the one who passed Gerald the envelope?" I asked. "I think," Wolfe said slowly, "that Gerald Fenwick was memorizing sins, and someone decided one sin too many had been witnessed." He looked at the vial again. "And I think the method of silence was floral, theatrical, and lethal." "And you want Saul to find the gardener?" Wolfe closed his eyes. "No, Archie, the snake hiding in the roses." The call came just after lunch, which, in the Wolfe household, is sacred and generally immune to interruption. Fritz had just set down a platter of sautéed chicken livers with truffle butter and a side of braised Belgian endive when the phone rang. Wolfe gave it 3 rings before sighing with the weight of civilization's collapse and nodding for me to answer. It was Inspector Kramer. "I assume," he said, "that your oversized employer is still pretending to avoid work." "He's actively succeeding at it," I said. "Until now. I'll make this quick. A body's turned up in the basement of the Hotel Belmar. Housekeeping found it in a linen cart. No wounds, no signs of a struggle. Just tucked in like yesterday's sheets. And it's your man, the waiter, Gerald Fenwick." I glanced at Wolfe, who had paused mid-chew. "Cause of death? Unknown. But the room was sealed. No forced entry, no disturbance. Just him, lying there, eyes open, in his service uniform. And," Kramer hesitated, "and something else, a folded napkin under his hand. No blood, no note, but it was pressed into his palm like a calling card." "Sounds theatrical." "It is. Which is why I'm letting your boss know. I want him not to get involved." "That'll do it," I said. Reverse psychology always works. I hung up and relayed the news. Wolfe dabbed his mouth with a linen napkin and stared at the livers as if they had personally disappointed him. "So," I said, "shall we continue with the chicken, or has the corpse piqued your palate?" "He was folded," Wolfe muttered. "Placed. That is not murder, that is punctuation. I take that as yes. Call Dr. Vollmer, he said. Request the autopsy report as soon as it's released. And Archie, yes, sir. Clear the evening. The game has changed. Dr. Vollmer's handwriting looked like it had survived an earthquake, just barely legible, but every letter carrying weight. The report arrived that evening by courier, sealed in a manila envelope with the usual stamps of medical authority and bureaucratic reluctance. Wolfe opened it slowly, read through the first page, and made a soft grunting noise somewhere between satisfaction and contempt. Poison, he said. As suspected. Fast or slow? I asked. Intermediate. Sufficient to immobilize within an hour, lethal within 2, administered in liquid form, possibly ingested. I reached into my drawer and pulled out the lilac-scented vial we'd found in Gerald's locker. Care to compare notes? He took it, uncorked it with the edge of a paper knife, and sniffed. His nostrils flared. Atropa belladonna, he said. Diluted, dissolvable. It would leave no taste detectable to the average palate. And the scent. Masking agent. Clever. Means of delivery? He closed his eyes. Not food. Gerald didn't eat with the patrons. But drink. Possibly a special order. A manipulated vintage. Perhaps something served to him in private. A toast to the silent witness, I muttered. Or a punishment disguised as a favour, Wolfe replied. He stood, an event rare enough to warrant its own headline. Belladonna is not a blunt instrument, Archie. It is elegant. The killer chose it with intent. Intent to erase or to warn? Both, perhaps even to stage a message. Wolfe tapped the edge of the autopsy report. The vial was the prelude. This, he held up the report, is the crescendo. What remains is the theme. I frowned. And you think it's personal? I think, Wolfe said gravely, that Gerald Fenwick was not the intended victim of fear, only the first to register its taste. It was the photograph that pulled the curtain back, just a little. I'd taken it from the envelope Miss Drayton left, meant to be Gerald's, no doubt, and had been staring at it off and on, waiting for something to click. The face screamed, frozen in a rictus of fear, and yet something bothered me. Not the expression, that was easy, it was the background. A sliver of patterned wallpaper, a glimpse of moulding. I made a call to Lon Cohen over at the Gazette, who owed me at least 3 favours and a bottle of gin. Do me a favour, Lon, I need to identify a face. That's new, you're usually trying to forget one. Can you get me a file photo of Alan Harshaw? Silence. Harshaw? He repeated. The hedge fund guy who died in the fire? That's the one. Why, you know something? I know a man who might have seen something, before he stopped seeing anything. A half-hour later, I had the photo. I compared it side by side with the screaming Polaroid. The cheekbones, the widow's peak, the curve of the ears, identical. Wolfe accepted the 2 photos and said nothing for a solid minute. Then, that is Alan Harshaw. But this, he held up the Polaroid, it was not taken before his alleged death. You're sure? Note the lapel pin. It commemorates the International Finance Conference held last month in Zurich, meaning he's alive. Wolfe's eyes darkened. And if Gerald had this, then he knew. He saw the man, recognized him, perhaps was meant to deliver the image as proof. Proof of survival? Or proof of betrayal? It is no longer simply a matter of a missing waiter, Archie. No, I said, looking again at that frozen scream. Now it's a matter of a dead man walking, and one who won't be walking much longer if Wolfe has his say. Wolfe had the Polaroid laid flat on his desk beneath the antique lamp, inspecting it with the same gravity he usually reserved for rare orchids or unintelligent people who dared speak in metaphors. Archie, he said, do you notice anything temporal? I gave it a glance. The expression is timeless, the wallpaper's tacky, the fear is fresh. Precisely the latter, he murmured. Fear doesn't fossilize so vividly unless it is recent. But let's be empirical. He pointed to the lower corner of the photo. A reflection, almost imperceptible, of a wine glass in mid-fall. Beside it, the sharp glint of something metallic. "Zoom in," he said, knowing full well we didn't zoom, he just meant look closer. The glint resolved itself, under Wolfe's guidance, into a lapel pin, one I had seen advertised in a finance column, a commemorative badge from the Zurich Financial Ethics Symposium held less than 2 months ago. "Well," I said, "that rules out ghosts." "It does more than that," Wolfe replied. "It tells us that Gerald did not stumble on a cold secret. He stepped directly onto a live wire. Meaning Harshaw's not just alive, he's active. And sloppy," Wolfe added. "He allowed himself to be seen, even photographed." Which raises a question. "Yes? Who gave Gerald the photo?" Wolfe's eyes closed briefly. "An ally or an enemy of Harshaw's, possibly both. But Gerald did not know the full scope of what he held. That much is evident from his behavior. He was a vessel, nothing more." "A vessel of what?" "Of memory, of truth, of leverage," I whistled. "So what happens when someone realizes the waiter isn't just silent, but memorizing everything?" Wolfe's eyes opened. "Then, Archie, someone makes certain he never serves another table again. Saul Panzer doesn't knock. He arrives. 1 minute there's air, the next there's Saul, calmly unwrapping layers of information like a man unbuttoning a silk vest. He stepped into the office with his usual understatement, a folder in one hand, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Wolfe," he said, "your ghost dines well." Wolfe, who had been reading La Gastronomie Française, didn't bother asking for clarification. He never does with Saul. "Name?" "Goes by Mr. Tilden, has a standing reservation every Thursday. At the Thistle Room, same table, private alcove, always alone, at least when seated. And otherwise?" "Receives visitors, unlisted businessmen, one from D.C., another from Geneva. No names, but I have faces. He never stays longer than 90 minutes. Pattern? Precise. Predictable, like clockwork, if the clock was afraid of being late. And his habits? Diet Coke, no alcohol, but he always has a glass of wine poured and untouched." Wolfe's brow rose a fraction. "A detail. Also," Saul continued, "he's got a man watching him. Older, likely former security, professional posture. He waits outside the club during meals, never enters." "So Harshaw surrounds himself with rituals and shadows," I said. "Doesn't that get exhausting?" "It's not protection," Wolfe murmured. "It's misdirection. A man who mimics normalcy while hiding a secret fears not exposure, but understanding." "Then why come out at all?" "Because the Thistle Room is where business is done," Wolfe said, "and Harshaw is not dead. He is merely—" His lips curled faintly. "In hiding among the silverware." Saul placed the folder on Wolfe's desk. "There's more. I trailed one of his visitors. The man went straight to the office of a commodities broker who, coincidentally, just dodged an SEC inquiry." Wolfe closed the book on his lap and set it aside. "Archie," he said, "we must speak with Fritz." Fritz came into the office with the same air of composed dread he reserved for situations where culinary sanctity might be breached. He held a small linen towel in one hand, folded twice, as if to remind himself that the world could still be orderly. "You wanted me, Mr. Wolfe?" "Yes. Please sit." Fritz sat, which in itself was unusual. The kitchen was his kingdom, and he rarely left it willingly unless one of us had done something unspeakable to a Béarnaise. "Fritz," Wolfe said, "do you recall a dish, obscure, regional, once prepared in northern Italy, involving diluted belladonna?" Fritz blinked. "You mean gallina alla nera?" "Precisely. It was banned in France years ago. The original recipe used minute traces of nightshade as a flavor accent." "Foolish. Even the trained hands who prepared it couldn't always judge the dosage. One drop too many, and the result was fatal." Archie and I exchanged glances. "Did anyone in New York ever try to recreate it?" Wolfe asked. "A few chefs did," Fritz said slowly. "But not in public kitchens. The liability alone would have shut them down. Still, I did hear of it being served unofficially at private tastings." Wolfe nodded. Could such a preparation be delivered discreetly, say, infused into a wine? Fritz considered. It would be risky, but yes. Belladonna has a bitter signature that when masked with lilac or clove could be hidden in a red with strong tannins. Bordeaux, perhaps? Could it be done with enough precision to kill over time? Fritz pursed his lips. Yes, if the person had access to both the kitchen and the wine cellar, but they'd need knowledge or help. Wolfe tapped his fingers against the desk. Someone arranged Gerald's death not with haste, but with choreography, a poison poured, a drink raised, and a witness silenced before the toast could settle. I leaned forward. You think it was during one of those private dining sessions? Wolfe nodded. Harshaw does not drink, yet wine is poured. Ritual without intention. It was not his glass in danger, but the one delivered elsewhere, perhaps to Gerald, perhaps via proxy. Then someone used the elegance of cuisine, Wolfe interrupted, to commit a murder as refined as the surroundings that concealed it. Fritz, pale now, stood. If someone used my kitchen, no one used you, Fritz, Wolfe said quietly, but someone used your world. When Nero Wolfe agrees to host a dinner with suspects, it's not because he's feeling social. It means the noose is halfway tied, and he's waiting for someone to lean into it. He announced it over his lunch of cornmeal griddle cakes and smoked trout. We shall invite them all, he said, to honor Mr. Fenwick, a memorial of sorts. Touching, I said. Will we be serving belladonna on toast? No, he replied evenly. We'll be serving anxiety with an aperitif of doubt. The guest list was drafted in the hour that followed. Ms. Leonora Drayton, Claudette Morel, Congressman Silas Varden, Lou Pinder, and, most delicately, Mr. Tilden, the man known elsewhere as Alan Harshaw. Saul confirmed he'd received the invitation through his usual proxy. Whether or not Harshaw would appear was anyone's bet, but Wolfe played odds others wouldn't touch. Fritz, appalled at the idea of cooking for guests who might have blood on their hands, nevertheless consented to prepare a restrained menu: cold consommé, guinea hen with tarragon glaze, and a bitter chocolate torte with espresso cream. We shall not seat ourselves in the dining room, Wolfe told me. This is not a meal, it is a demonstration. He insisted the parlour be rearranged, not dramatically, just enough to unsettle a practised eye. The chairs were reupholstered, dusted, spaced equidistantly, facing the central desk like attendees at a tribunal. I suppose I should bring wine? I asked. Certainly not, he said. We are not indulging, we are extracting. It was the sort of phrase Wolfe dropped like a breadcrumb in a labyrinth, just enough to suggest the exit, but not enough to show the way. I sent the invitations, confirmed the guests, arranged the cars, and polished the crystal pitcher that would sit untouched on the table. And by 7 o'clock that evening, the brownstone no longer felt like a home, it felt like a snare. The fake menu had taken me all of 12 minutes to draft, but getting it to look like Gerald Fenwick's had taken longer. His handwriting, as reported by Claudette, was small, clean, slightly slanted, and meticulous. I spent 2 hours mimicking it with the help of one of Fritz's old grocery lists and a magnifying glass. The result was a folded cream-coloured page with neat, elegant scrawl and enough bait to hook a shark. I titled it Dinner Observations, April 3rd, from GF. Underneath I wrote, Table 9, Harshaw, alias Tilden, requests unlisted pour, leaves glass untouched, notes in margin of wine list, 3 visitors, all nervous. 1 spoke Serbian, no name, smell of lilac lingered on tray. Wolfe reviewed it without expression. Good, omit the date. But that's what makes it sound authentic. It also makes it traceable. Leave ambiguity. The guilty are more responsive to smoke than fire. I nodded. You think whoever reads this will think Gerald knew too much? No, Wolfe said. I think they'll believe Gerald recorded too much, which is worse. I slipped the folded paper into an envelope, scuffed it lightly to give the illusion of having been carried in a pocket or hidden behind a radiator, and placed it where Wolfe instructed, on the arm of the empty chair beside Lou Pinder's. You're putting it next to the bartender, I said. Yes, Wolfe murmured, because he is most likely to reach for the match even if someone else struck the first flame. The room was set. The lie was written. Now all that remained was to see who would try to bury it. They arrived as requested, on time, dressed in grey tones and strained smiles. Grief was not a requirement, performance was. Leonora Drayton took the first chair without comment, her handbag tucked like a shield against her ribs. Claudette hovered before sitting, giving me a quick glance as if to say, "I'm here, don't ask me why." Congressman Varden entered late, accompanied by the faint scent of cologne and entitlement. Lou Pinder came alone, no tie, but his shoes polished to a mirror. And then, unexpectedly, Mr. Tilden arrived, or rather, Alan Harshaw did. He entered with the casual arrogance of a man used to walking into private clubs where everyone knew not to question his membership. His eyes scanned the room. He nodded once, to no one in particular, and sat. Wolfe did not rise. He rarely did. "Thank you for attending," he said. "This is not a mourning, it is a clarification." They stared. Silence thickened. Wolfe gestured to the envelope resting on the chair arm. "That document, found among Mr. Fenwick's effects, is a page from what he may have intended as a memoir. We are uncertain how many copies exist. Possibly one, possibly more." Varden shifted. Claudette looked down. Lou Pinder swallowed. "I have asked you here," Wolfe continued, "because each of you appeared in Gerald Fenwick's life in the final days before his death, some of you more prominently than others." He turned to Drayton. "Did Gerald ever suggest he was compiling a record?" "No," she said. "But he noticed everything. To you, Mr. Pinder, did Gerald ever speak of concern, paranoia? Number?" He kept to himself. "And yet," Wolfe said, "your fingerprints were found on the glass he handled the night before he vanished." Lou paled. "I clean glasses. It's my job." Wolfe turned to Harshaw. "Do you recognize the handwriting?" Harshaw smiled. "It's not mine. Number, but it might be yours to fear." He didn't answer. But his gaze dropped to the envelope, then flicked toward Claudette. In that moment, I knew Wolfe had seen it too, who reacted, how long it took, and what they were now trying not to say. And then the bell rang. Saul Panzer had returned. Saul's entrance was like a minor weather event. No sound, no show, just the sudden rearrangement of the room's pressure. He handed Wolfe a folder without so much as a nod. Wolfe opened it, scanned the contents, and laid it gently across the desk like an ace on green velvet. "Mr. Harshaw," Wolfe said without raising his voice, "I believe you are acquainted with the Federal Identity Protection Program?" Harshaw didn't blink. "I have legal counsel and immunity." "Yes. A charming concept, immunity. It often works on paper." Wolfe's voice cooled a degree, but not always in practice. The folder contained documents, one a transportation log, another a photograph from the Zurich conference, a third a memo from an unnamed federal office. "You are, in fact, Alan Harshaw. You faked your death to escape indictment, adopted the alias Tilden, and have been conducting illicit transactions under the cloak of government assistance." Harshaw leaned back, crossed his legs. "None of which connects me to the death of a waiter." "Ah," Wolfe murmured. "But you see, it connects you to the fear of that waiter. Gerald did not need to act. His presence was sufficient to constitute threat." Drayton spoke quietly. "You killed him?" "I didn't touch him," Harshaw said. "And you won't prove otherwise." Wolfe looked to Saul. "The wine bottle?" Saul nodded. "Recovered from the hotel suite. Traces of diluted belladonna, fingerprints wiped, but fibers match linen used at the Thistle Room." Wolfe folded his hands. "Intent is rarely provable in isolation, but pattern, Mr. Harshaw, pattern is your enemy." And, for once, Harshaw said nothing, because now the pattern was inescapable. If there's one thing Nero Wolfe enjoys more than orchids and justice, it's panic, controlled panic, cultivated like a delicate root vegetable harvested at just the right moment, and nothing creates a finer crop of dread than the suggestion of exposure. "Lon Cohen," I said, dialing the Gazette. "I need a favor." "That's never a good sign," Lon grunted. "How inflammatory." "Not libelous, just suggestive. Pure fiction, but very printable fiction." I relayed Wolfe's instructions. Lon, to his credit, didn't ask questions. 3 hours later, a rumor was circulating through certain channels like a drop of ink in a bowl of consommé. A blackmail diary, allegedly written by late waiter Gerald Fenwick, was rumored to contain names, dates, and compromising details about several high-profile Thistle Room clients. The Gazette wouldn't run it, not yet, but they'd received it. It was enough. At 6 sharp the next evening, Wolfe had the radio tuned low, and I had my ear to the ground. Lou Pinder called in sick. Congressman Varden's office issued a denial of any connection to unsubstantiated rumors. Claudette sent a single sentence by courier. "Tell Mr. Wolfe I didn't know it was dangerous." As for Mr. Tilden, Harshaw, he made no comment, but Saul noted his security detail doubled overnight. Wolfe was immobile in his chair, eyes closed, hands templed. "Do you believe Gerald wrote the journal?" I asked. "Of course not," he replied. "But belief is irrelevant. The question is, who fears its existence? And if one of them thinks it's about to be published?" Wolfe's mouth curved slightly. "Then someone will act to retrieve or suppress what never existed. And when they do, we shall know who among them considers Gerald's memory worth killing twice." I stood, stretching. "So we're baiting ghosts now?" "No," Wolfe murmured. "We are baiting guilt. Ghosts come later." That night I received a call from the Thistle Room's maitre d'. Claudette had collapsed. Mid-shift. After sipping her usual cocktail. The game, as they say, was advancing. Claudette Morel didn't strike me as the swooning type. Nervous, yes. Tight-lipped, certainly. But not prone to dramatic interruptions of consciousness. So when I heard she'd keeled over at her post after 2 sips of a French 75, I knew someone was rattled. She was taken to Bellevue, conscious but hazy. I paid a visit, playing the role of concerned friend with a clipped tie and a smirk for the nurses. She blinked at me, lids heavy but working. "Someone tampered with the drink," she murmured. I felt it." "What did you taste?" I asked. She hesitated. "Not lilac. Something bitter. It hit after the citrus." "Intentional?" She nodded slowly. "I didn't order it. Lou brought it." I stiffened. "Lou's on sick leave." "Then someone else. Someone trying to tell me not to talk." I called Wolfe from the hallway. He picked up after 2 rings, a rarity. "She's awake," I said, "and scared. Someone slipped her something in a cocktail. Not lethal, just persuasive." "That is not persuasion," Wolfe replied. "That is escalation." "You think it was a warning?" "I think," Wolfe said, "that Harshaw has not lost control, but he is no longer the only one pulling strings." That gave me pause. "You think there's someone else?" "Someone with more to lose," Wolfe replied. "Or less patience." Back at the brownstone, Wolfe asked Fritz for coffee, not beer, not sherry. Coffee. That alone told me the temperature of his thoughts. As he sipped, he said, "Archie, we must accelerate before someone else chooses a stronger dose." Meaning, someone believes that silence is still purchasable. I intend to raise the price. By proving," Wolfe said, eyes narrowing, "that the one drink meant to kill Gerald Fenwick wasn't the only one ever poured." I nodded. "So what now?" He looked up at me, precisely, fully. "We seat them again," he said. "And this time we do not offer the menu, we serve the bill." They arrived not out of courtesy, but compulsion, the kind born of Wolfe's carefully cultivated whispers, deliberate leaks, and the magnetic pull of guilt poorly buried. Once again the chairs were arranged. Fritz had polished the silver tray, though it carried nothing but ice water and a bowl of olives, unremarkable, untouched. I stood by the globe in the corner, playing the role of informal observer and sharp-eyed scribe. Leonora Drayton sat upright, fingers laced like a debutante at judgment. Claudette, still pale from her chemical interlude, hovered on the edge of her seat. Lou Pinder had his jaw clenched tight enough to crack walnuts. Congressman Varden exhaled audibly once and said nothing since. And Alan Harshaw, alias Tilden, wore a faint, fixed smile, the sort lawyers recommend for funerals and depositions. Wolfe waited until the air thickened with anticipation, then leaned forward, letting gravity assist his presence. "You were all, in some fashion," he began, "present in the final days of Gerald Fenwick's life." A slight shuffle, nothing vocal. "You were not summoned here to deny that. You are here because each of you contributed by action, omission, or fear to the conditions that killed him." Varden started to protest. Wolfe cut him off with a glance sharp enough to halt legislation. "He died not by accident nor impulse. He was selected. His removal was curated. And before I identify the hand that moved the glass, I shall illuminate the why." He gestured subtly. I stepped forward and placed a slim leather-bound journal on the desk, no words on the cover, no name on the spine, just the implication of secrets. Harshaw's fingers twitched. "Before you speak," Wolfe said, eyes narrowing, "understand that Gerald Fenwick did not write this to extort you." He paused. "He wrote it to remember you." "The question," Wolfe said, "that none of you asked, but all of you feared, was simple. How much did he remember?" He let the words settle, like dust in a shaft of light. "You believed Gerald Fenwick to be mute in every way but mechanical. A man who served and vanished. What you failed to see was that he did not blink because he could not afford to." I cleared my throat and read aloud from the journal. Table 4, March 9th. Varden requested no garnish, but added a note to hostess. "We were never here." Same phrase third time. Same woman, blonde, anxious. Varden flushed, but said nothing. Table 7, March 11th. Mr. T ordered private pour. Did not drink. Guests rotated every 20 minutes. First man left napkin with thumbprint in wine glass rim. Smell, lilac and black pepper. Harshaw shifted. Lou Pinder leaned forward as if trying to intercept the words. "Gerald's condition," Wolfe continued, "was uncommon. A photographic memory. He recalled not only conversations but inflections, scents, subtle movements. A waiter, yes, but also a witness. Every service, every tray, every misplaced handkerchief filed precisely in a brain unclouded by assumption." He let that sink in. His unblinking gaze was not affectation, it was preservation. The blink, you see, disrupts the image. Gerald took no chances. Drayton exhaled softly, as if a truth she'd suspected now bore its full weight. "Such a man," Wolfe said, "becomes a threat simply by existing. He does not need to accuse, to threaten, or even imply. His silence is unbearable because it leaves imagination to do the rest." Lou stood abruptly. "He never told me that." "Of course not," Wolfe said coldly. "Because he didn't need to. He only needed to look at you and you felt seen." Harshaw narrowed his eyes. "Then why keep a journal?" Wolfe's smile was almost fond. To put down what even he could not carry indefinitely. And perhaps because he knew one day someone would try to stop him. "You assumed he wanted money," Wolfe said, "that he was building a case for leverage." He turned to Harshaw. "Did it never occur to you that not everyone trades in currency?" Harshaw shrugged. "Information has value." "Yes," Wolfe replied, "but value does not equal motive. Gerald was no blackmailer. He was a chronicler." Claudette spoke for the first time. Her voice was low but clear. "He said once that people forget waiters are there, but they're always there, and they see everything." Wolfe nodded once. Gerald was compiling a memoir. Not for publication, at least not immediately. Perhaps for history. perhaps for insurance, perhaps for the simple justice of truth. I read another excerpt from the journal. Hostess warned not to mention the Varden scene. Pinder, agitated, heard him mutter, "He's writing it all down." Later asked if I'd said anything. I hadn't. Lou Pinder's mouth opened, then closed. "None of you could tolerate the ambiguity," Wolfe said. "Was he writing about you? Had he named you? Had he shown someone else? You became consumed not by what he did, but what he might do." He let the silence answer. "Someone," Wolfe continued, "and decided that silence was safer than suspense. But you were wrong. Because Gerald did not shout his secrets. He wrote them quietly like recipes in a forgotten kitchen." Drayton's fingers trembled against her lap. "Then who?" Wolfe turned his gaze to Lou. "You, Mr. Pinder, had access to Gerald's glass. You adjusted the tray. You were seen near the wine locker the night the bottle was poured." "I didn't—" "You did," Wolfe said without raising his voice. "Because Harshaw needed someone disposable, someone owed him. Someone already too nervous to ask questions." He pointed to the journal. "And you thought if you poured the poison, you could erase the page." Lou sagged in his chair. "But memory," Wolfe said, "isn't erased with wine." Wolfe tapped the edge of the photograph, the one found in Gerald's belongings, lightly against his palm. Harshaw's face stared up in frozen panic, the scream preserved like a pressed flower. "This," Wolfe said, "was not taken years ago. It was recent, very recent." Harshaw didn't move. His stillness wasn't the heavy immobility of Wolfe's. It was thinner, more brittle, like glass waiting for a chip. Wolfe continued. "This image was slipped to Gerald anonymously, perhaps with the intent of warning him or recruiting him. But Gerald, as we've established, was not a man easily swayed. He filed it away, recorded it, perhaps waited to see what emerged next." He paused. "Unfortunately, what emerged was you, Mr. Harshaw." Harshaw looked to Varden, who looked determined to remain as irrelevant as possible. "You revealed yourself. You appeared in public. You dined discreetly. And Gerald recognized you." "I didn't kill him," Harshaw said calmly. "No," Wolfe replied. "You commissioned his death." Drayton gasped. Pinder blinked rapidly. "You feared exposure, not only of your false death, but of your business dealings, those meetings, those transactions, those names. Gerald's memory was too perfect, too dangerous." He turned the photograph around. "This was a thread, and you knew, Mr. Harshaw, that if it were ever pulled, everything you built would unravel." Harshaw's fingers twitched against the arm of the chair. "I told Lou to scare him. That was all." Wolfe's voice hardened. But fear is rarely well measured, especially when placed in the hands of a man already compromised. He looked to Lou. "And you were compromised, weren't you?" Lou didn't answer. He didn't have to. Wolfe turned now, deliberately, to Lou Pinder. "Mr. Pinder," he said, "you were not paid. You were pressured." Lou's jaw moved, but no words came. "You owe Harshaw, not financially, but historically. A past incident, sealed, unspoken, but binding. You were arrested once, years ago, minor charge, dismissed before arraignment, but not before someone made it vanish, someone like Harshaw." Lou flinched. "You repaid him by staying useful," Wolfe continued. "You served drinks, cleaned glasses, and when instructed you selected the bottle, masked the scent, prepared the pour." "I didn't mean to kill him," Lou said suddenly. He was going to ruin everything." "Whose everything?" I asked, stepping forward. Lou's hands trembled. Mine, Harshaw's, Varden's, that whole table. He knew too much. He didn't talk, but he wrote, and smiled, like he was already past it. Wolfe spoke with clipped precision. "You believed Gerald wouldn't drink from the glass, that he'd suspect, or that it would frighten him. But he did drink." Lou looked up at Wolfe, defeated. "He never flinched," he said. "Even when I handed it to him. He just looked at me, like he already knew." "He probably did," Wolfe replied. Lou said nothing more. There was a long silence. Then Lou stood. Not fast, not with panic, just with the careful movement of someone reaching for an excuse to leave before they heard the rest of their sentence read aloud. He turned, made 2 steps toward the door. "Don't," I said, stepping forward. He froze, his shoulders sagged. "I'd sit," I added. He sat. Wolfe's eyes found Harshaw once again. "You," he said, "you will not be arrested, not today. You enjoy protections not afforded to better men." Harshaw opened his mouth, closed it again. "But understand this. If you remain in this city or appear in public in any recognizable form, I shall inform the Department of Justice that your death was executed with the assistance of those you now attempt to betray by silence." Harshaw's face hardened. "You have a choice, Mr. Harshaw. Disgrace or exposure." There was no response, just the sound of a breath held too long. After they were gone, Harshaw silently, Lou in cuffs, Fritz brought in coffee. Wolfe didn't thank him, but he drank it slowly. "Gerald Fenwick," he said finally, "was not remarkable by trade, but by temperament." I sat down. "You think he knew it would come to this?" "I think," Wolfe said, "he knew something was coming. He could see the pattern. Men like that often do." He looked at the empty chair, the one Gerald would have served from, never sat in. He did not shout. He did not accuse. He merely observed. And that, Wolfe murmured, was enough to destroy them. He closed his eyes, a gesture more respect than rest. "To the waiter," I said, quietly, lifting my cup. "The one who never blinked." Wolfe didn't respond, but for once he didn't object to the toast. The orchid room was warm and unusually still that morning. Wolfe had been tending to his Miltonias with more than his typical reverence, which was saying something. There was something ceremonial about it, the way he pinched dead stems, trimmed root systems, and watered as if speaking in apology. Fritz brought in the Morning Post with coffee and toast. Amid the usual stack of circulars, invoices, and correspondence from Wolfe's botanical contacts, there was a cream envelope with no return address and a faint lavender scent. Wolfe opened it. He read the contents once, then again, slower. He passed it to me without comment. "Mr. Wolfe, I have resigned. The Thistle Room has been closed. Some endings are not decisions, only recognitions. Gerald deserved better. Thank you for not letting his silence be the last word. Claudette Morel." I folded the letter. Graceful. "He was not her equal," Wolfe said. "No," I agreed. "But perhaps her turning point." Wolfe turned back to his orchids. "There are few honors greater than to be remembered well by one you did not demand to impress." I didn't respond. It wasn't needed. Sometimes even Wolfe lets the orchids do the talking. The news came officially 3 days later. Ms. Leonora Drayton had shuttered the Thistle Room, citing financial re-evaluation and evolving patron expectations. What she didn't cite, but what everyone with a mind and a memory knew, was that you can't serve elegance beside bloodstains and expect the wine to taste the same. "I imagine the members were displeased," I said, folding the morning paper and setting it beside my cup. "Temporarily," Wolfe replied. "They will find another establishment, one with fresh linen and unspoiled mirrors." "But not another Gerald Fenwick?" "No." There was a note in the article that caught my eye, a quote from Drayton herself. "A room that thrives on discretion must also carry the burden of its silences. Ours became too heavy to serve." "She has a way with words," I said. "She has the restraint to use them rarely," Wolfe murmured. I looked at him over my coffee. "You'll miss it? The restaurant? The case?" He considered. "I will not miss the duplicity or the perfumes, but I concede the structure was interesting. Like a souffle? Like an autopsy performed on fine linen." I grinned. "You should write restaurant reviews." He snorted and went back to his book. The Thistle Room was gone, the patrons dispersed, but some menus, once tasted, leave afternotes that linger. It's a rare thing to see Nero Wolfe at a loss, not for words, but for interruption. Yet on the Thursday following the final arrest, he remained uncharacteristically still for nearly an hour, saying nothing and doing less. He sat by the fireplace in the office, index fingers steepled, eyes not closed but unfocused, as if surveying some invisible guest list. When he did speak, it was not addressed to me, nor anyone in particular. He had no audience, Wolfe said. He served without fanfare, recorded without reward, and departed without protest. And still, he was the most dangerous man in the room. Gerald. Yes, he paused. We ascribe power to noise, to presence, to rank. But Gerald's danger was his fidelity to observation. He did not need to accuse, he only needed to remember. He did not need to build a case. His memory was its own cross-examination. I let the moment hold. Would you have hired him? I asked. As what? Your assistant? Wolfe scowled. Certainly not. He lacked temperament. He was passive, silent, stoic. And yet, Wolfe said quietly, he saw more in one dining room than many see in a lifetime of investigations. He glanced at me, not quite smiling. Even you, Archie, with all your flair, would benefit from blinking less and noticing more. Noted, I said. Though I like blinking, keeps me from staring at your face too long. Pfui. But even as he turned back to his book, I saw it, the faintest upturn at the corner of his mouth. Gerald had been seen. That was enough. That night, over a plate of Fritz's oxtail ragout and a second glass of Barolo, I floated the idea I'd been sitting on since Claudette's letter arrived. You know, I said, I've been thinking. Maybe I'll write something, not a memoir exactly, but a record. My own version of Gerald's journal, Wolfe, didn't look up. With what objective? Truth, reflection, market value, take your pick. He harumphed. And subject your prose to the indignities of typesetting. Hey, I've read worse. Doubtless, but rarely published under reputable imprint. Come on, I said. You don't think I can write? I think you are capable of generating words. That is not writing. I held up a napkin. I've started already. First line. Nero Wolfe was the most intolerable genius ever to refuse movement before lunch. He rolled his eyes. Your grammar limps, your rhythm is offensive, but your sentiment is, regrettably, accurate. I grinned. So, permission? He sighed. Archie, do what you must, but for heaven's sake, omit the spelling errors and the adjectives. Even magnificent? Especially magnificent. I saluted him with my fork and turned back to my ragout. The case was closed, the orchids were in bloom. And maybe, just maybe, the next chapter was mine to write. The envelope was thin, hand-addressed in a script that tilted slightly like someone trying to appear stronger than they felt. Fritz brought it in with the morning mail and placed it beside Wolfe's breakfast tray as reverently as if it contained blueprints for a lost cathedral. Wolfe opened it without ceremony, scanned the brief lines, then passed it to me. He did not comment. He rarely does when emotion has been disguised well enough to satisfy his standards. Mr. Wolfe, I wanted to thank you. Not for solving anything, but for finishing it. Gerald was kind. Strange, yes, but kind. He never asked for anything, but he remembered everything. I've left the Thistle Room. It no longer deserves its name. I hope that somewhere, someone remembers Gerald, not for what he saw, but for what he carried so quietly. Thank you again. Claudette Morel. I refolded the letter and set it on the desk. She meant that? I said. Yes, Wolfe murmured, reaching for his coffee. Unfashionable, perhaps, but sincere. Outside, the orchids were blooming. The house was still. Wolfe didn't return to his reading. Instead, he looked at the letter for a long while, as if it were a cipher that didn't require solving, just understanding. The official announcement arrived via a food industry bulletin that Fritz subscribes to. The Thistle Room, it said, was closing its doors permanently. No reopening, no renovation. Just a quiet exit, like a maitre d' bowing out before the applause could fade. Ms. Drayton, quoted sparingly, said the establishment had fulfilled its function. That was the phrase, fulfilled its function. A delicately phrased epitaph for a space that had fed more secrets than souls. She's right, Wolfe said when I read it aloud. The institution did not collapse, it completed itself. I grunted. In a blaze of lilac-scented poison and a dead waiter? No, he replied. In a reckoning. The end was in the beginning. The menu was only ever a preface. I didn't argue, I couldn't. The restaurant had survived scandals, politics, even fashion. What it couldn't survive was memory. I thought of the tables Gerald used to serve, the ones where men like Harshaw smiled thinly and passed folded notes beneath embossed napkins. They'd treated the silence as currency, until someone like Gerald proved that silence isn't always compliant. I tossed the bulletin in the wastebasket and turned back to my notebook. Think she'll open another place? No, Wolfe said. Some palates, once spoiled, are never cleansed. There was no triumph in his voice, just the sound of a man who knew the difference between closure and justice, and had learned, reluctantly, to settle for the former. That evening, long after Fritz had retired to his quarters and the house had sunk into the kind of hush only an old brownstone can sustain, Wolfe did something unusual. He spoke. Gerald Fenwick, he said, was an anomaly. I didn't look up from the report I was filing, but I paused just enough to let him know I was listening. He lived without ambition, Wolfe continued. No advancement, no rebellion. He merely performed his task with precision and with quiet. A lesser man might have called it servitude. And a greater man, I asked, would call it discipline. He sipped his beer, eyes not leaving the fire. It is fashionable, he went on, to dismiss the unnoticed, to assume that observation without voice is merely passivity. But Gerald, he was never passive. He absorbed, not to judge, not even to react, but to retain. And that made him dangerous. To people like Harshaw. To anyone who mistook their secrets for shadows, Wolfe said. He was silent for a beat. He wrote nothing salacious, no threats, no demands, just a ledger of human behavior as seen through the unblinking eyes of a man who had mastered the art of invisibility. I leaned back. He'd make a lousy novelist. On the contrary, Wolfe said, he would make the best kind, one who wrote not for praise, but because truth had weight and he carried it. It was not a eulogy, Wolfe did not offer those, but it was something close, a rare moment where intellect bent gently toward reverence, for a waiter, for a witness, for the man who remembered too much and said nothing at all. A few nights later, I mentioned I'd been toying with a little something. Nothing scandalous, just a manuscript, a memoir of sorts. Wolfe, predictably, didn't lift an eyebrow. You mean fiction disguised as recollection? Memoir, I said, with wit, style, and the occasional flourish. Then I hope you will omit adjectives, I grinned. Why, so you don't have to correct my spelling? I would correct more than that. Your syntax is criminal. I pulled out a page. Sample line. The genius in the chair weighed 280 pounds, but his mind floated like a butterfly and stung like a lawsuit. Wolfe closed his eyes, pained. If you publish that, I shall deny knowing you. Noted. He opened one eye. Still, I suppose the public has endured worse. I'll take that as encouragement. You'll take it, Wolfe said dryly, as conditional tolerance. But I expect at least 2 chapters on grammar. Yours or mine? Yours, of course. Mine needs no defense. I folded the page and slipped it back into my folder. It wasn't approval, but it was as close as Wolfe ever came. Gerald Fenwick had his journal, I would have mine. And between us, maybe silence wouldn't have the last word after all.